Welcome back to my channel, God's Hands on the Wheel of Time. I'm Sammy McKee, and as part of this introductory series, this is part 2, where I want to look at the astrological ages and what actually is going on that is causing civilization to repeat its pattern of rising and falling and declining and corrupting of society and culture over 2,140 years apart, time and time again. For me personally, my research actually went backwards from how I'm introducing this. I was first interested in Nostradamus, the idea of astrological ages, of the Platonic year, the great year, and it was from there that I went and started to see if history was repeating. So since in the last episode I showed how history repeated by talking about them all at the same time, in this episode I really want to spend time looking at each age and taking it step by step through the ages. Now, first of all, what the ages are related to are the precession of the equinox, how on the spring equinox in every year the sun rises in a particular astrological sign. Well, that changes over the course of 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 years. And so that is what is dictating what age we are in. Now, that's kind of a gray area. Like, when does it technically pass from, say, for example, Aries into Pisces, or from Pisces into Aquarius? And what we see in the historical activity that's going on is that there isn't really like these hard stopping points. Yes, we can find the middle ground of when there's a clear split in the ages, but it's kind of like they blur, right? I mean, we already in the United States today have influences from the Age of Aquarius. During the crisis of the late Roman Republic, they had influences from the upcoming Age of Pisces that were causing the corruption and the corrosion into the empire that comes along. And so starting out, we have Sumer emerge, the Ubayyad period of Sumer in the Age of Gemini. Gemini is a communication sign. So what this isn't like an empire in the traditional sense, even a trade empire for that matter. This is really just a culture spreading its way of life. It's very egalitarian, prosperous way of life throughout Mesopotamia from Sumer. And it seems to, in the material culture, look like the local governments are very meritocratic. There's no concentration of wealth amongst the elites. They kind of just trade and share resources and everything's nice. Well, as they start to move towards the Age of Taurus, right, people are concentrating wealth. They're starting to control trade. The priests that come along realize this, and they start to become the wealthiest members of society by having sacrifices to the gods and having these great temples, these ziggurats built. They start to control trade routes and control cities outright. And so that is when we see the Uruk period start to emerge. At the start of the Age of Taurus, this empire begins. This is what I want to get into right here at the very beginning, this idea of seasons. Within each age, there are these seasons that are unfolding. So again, looking at the Age of Gemini, where we get the best time period at the late Ubayyad period, is the spring season, if you divide it by 4, of the Age of Gemini. That's when it's the most prosperous time period. As we go into the Age of Taurus, into this Uruk period, it's the summer season of Uruk, right? Well, what does the summer do? The summer takes and just starts to bake, right, the vegetation and the flourishing life that had come about in the spring. That's what the summer season does in each age. It takes and it starts to, we see it as corruption and corrosion, but what they're doing is they're basically living off the greatness of the spring. Well, we really see this is in the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic really conquered the entire Mediterranean. It was at its peak right around when Caesar came territorially. It economically dominated. It was very, very prosperous. When the empire comes along, it really never expands. I mean, what do they add? Dacia, a bunch of barbarians, or add Mesopotamia for 15 years? They don't really expand again after that point. The Roman Empire is just basically sucking the life in just a complete slow decline of Roman civilization. In terms of the sun and what the sun does every year, from the summer solstice onward, the sun starts to drift away from us, starts to get further and further away. Even though the ground is baking, the earth is baking because it was at its closest point, it slowly is declining. That's the same thing that happens with each age. The Roman Empire is this slow decline from what was a prosperous and flourishing Roman Republic. This takes you to a point eventually where you get to what? You get to the autumn season. And I love the name the fall because that's what's happening. The Germanic tribes come in. It's the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, civilization doesn't collapse outright. The Byzantines continue. The Germanic tribes eventually become the Carolingians, the Carolingian Renaissance. It's not a terrible time period, right? It's not a dark age, the early Middle Ages. But what we eventually have happen at the end of the fall season is the arrival of the Vikings, the destruction of civilization. Like a dark age begins with the start of winter. Now that's the dead bottom point, right? We call that the dark age, but really civilization's coming out and rising back up from that point on, from the start of winter and eventually to the spring. So from the high Middle Ages, it's actually a steady progression. We eventually get to the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. Around 1600, you're in the spring. And now the spring civilization is flourishing. This new modern age, European civilization's coming about in the spring season of Pisces, okay? So going back again to looking at Taurus. Taurus in its summer season, it's this early Uruk. The Uruk spreads all the way across the Fertile Crescent. And then at the start of the fall season of Taurus, we have the Semitic-speaking peoples first arrive. And they cut the Uruk civilization off from the rest of the Fertile Crescent by moving into the northern Mesopotamia. Then we have, towards the end of that autumn season, another group come in, and that's the Western Semitic-speaking peoples, and they actually cause the early Bronze Age to begin, right? That's now the winter season. And from that point on, in the early Bronze Age, we're now moving back upwards. Civilization in the Age of Taurus is now starting to coalesce in the early Bronze Age into this new civilization in the Fertile Crescent, which includes the dynastic period of Sumer, which includes Ebla, and includes this new time period in the early Bronze Age that spreads to Egypt right at the end of the Age of Taurus. And again, Egypt now is this trade civilization, this civilization that's based on art and prosperity, and they're sending trade expeditions out to Byblos and Punt and Nubia and the Aegean to, they're not controlling with swords. They're not even controlling like the Ubayyad were with the cultural spread. They're controlling through trade. They really represent Taurus in its flowering of civilization. That eventually, though, what do we have happen? We have a breaking point between the Age of Taurus and the Age of Aries, where we see that Egyptian civilization start to give way to warlord pharaohs, to the first intermediate period, to the Middle Kingdom. And by the time we get into the summer season of the Age of Aries, we have this Middle Kingdom of Egypt really living off of the greatness of the Old Kingdom, right? And they're warlords. They're not building pyramids. They're not building great structures like the Old Kingdom was. And their prosperity is nothing like it. They're enslaving their people basically as these totalitarian autocratic rulers. They go out and conquer the Levant. They're not trading with these people. They're conquering them. They're enslaving at the hilt of a sword, not through trade. And so that is the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. And again, that's the summer season of Aries, this very warlike sign. Well, eventually what happens? You have even more warlike people come in with their chariots, right? And the Messenians, the ultimate warlike people, the Hittites come in. And the Indo-Europeans displace Middle Kingdom of Egypt's influence around the fall season of the Age of Aries. And that's the first wave that comes in. And we have the Messenian civilization actually flower during this autumn season when the New Kingdom's still around, the Messenians are around, the Hittites are around. But what happens at the end of the autumn season? Right as we're starting to move into winter, boom, the Bronze Age collapse comes. The Sea Peoples arrive, these Indo-Europeans that are even more warlike and destructive than the people that were before them. And they usher in the Dark Ages of Greece, the winter season of the Age of Aries, this time where civilization's restarting. It's now the Iron Age. We're not even in the Bronze Age anymore. And notice what's happening at the middle of each age there. You have in the middle of the Age of Taurus, the start of the early Bronze Age. You have in the middle of the Age of Aries, the start of the Iron Age. And now a new civilization's emerging. As we go through the winter season of Aries, as we get into the spring season of Aries, we're now seeing the Greeks emerge, right? The axial age, the age of Greek philosophy, Greek civilization emerging, right? We're leaving the Dark Age as we get into the spring, and it moves and it spreads to Rome. And Rome is now this flowering of civilization that, is very prosperous. Now, they're all still representing this Age of Aries characteristics. Well, like I said, where consuls of the Roman Republic are literally generals, oftentimes leading from the war front. I mean, the heroes of this time period during the spring season, Alexander the Great, right? Hannibal, they are all really exhibiting these warlike characteristics of Aries, but it's during the spring season. It's like the great honorable aspects of the Age of Aries. But of course, what happens to the Roman Republic? It starts to decline. And as we move from the spring season of Aries into the summer season of Pisces, we see a decay of Roman civilization. This break begin where Pisces is a sign that in its worst is assassinations, propaganda. The negative aspects are basically the people not realizing what's actually going on. It's very deceitful. And that's what the Roman emperors were. They proclaim themselves as saviors of the republic, but they're ruling as dictators. They may as well be kings, but they won't put a crown on their head, right? It's all propaganda. And when you look at the entire Roman Empire, it's just, like I said, a steady decline of the greatness of the Roman Republic. And eventually they just start to eat each other up. And then as we get into the fall season of the Age of Pisces, in come the Germanic tribes, right? And it looks like on the surface that new kingdoms have emerged. A whole new civilization has emerged. But really, it's Latin civilization. The Germanic peoples came in. They're still following the Pope. They're being crowned by the Pope in Rome, right? Again, that's these aspects where the people think they're being ruled by these Germanic kings, and really they're paying taxes to the Pope in Rome. Really, the kings are crowned by the Pope in Rome. That's very Age of Pisces-esque, if you will. And so as we get into the end of the fall season of the Age of Pisces, what happens? The Vikings come in and they bring about the winter season, this collapse of civilization, the beginning of the High Middle Ages, where things actually start to move back up again. They destroy the Carolingian Empire, but in the shattered, breakage, and now come the Crusades, and now come the late Middle Ages, and now come the Renaissance. And where are we now? We get into the spring season of the Age of Pisces, this flowering of civilization under the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. Eventually, the 13 colonies in the United States come along, this land of opportunity and abundance during the spring season. And that's one thing that's characteristic of all the spring seasons, is the discovery of a new world, an untouched land. The Greeks called Italy Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, where they set up colonies, and there's a land of opportunity where every inch of Greece you could find a city-state, right? You couldn't just go somewhere and create a new opportunity for yourself. But if you went across over to Italy, it was virtually untouched. That's what Rome was. It was expanding into this land of opportunity. Of course, we know that about the United States of America. The Europeans are pouring over to the Americas as a land of opportunity, this untouched ecological paradise, the closest we've been since the Garden of Eden to a land of opportunity, which I'll talk about in part 3. Same can be said of Egypt as they're leaving the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, where there's all these city-states and it's overpopulated practically, and it's also seen ecological decay for the last 2,000 years. Egypt and the Nile is this land of opportunity, this land of prosperity and ecological flourishing. And that's what Sumer was back when it began under the Ubayyad period. But here we are, the United States, moving towards now the summer season of the Age of Aquarius. And what do we see happening? We see the crisis of the United States beginning. 2,140 years after the crisis of the Roman Republic. 2,140 years after the reign of Pepi II, when the old kingdom of Egypt began to decline into the first intermediate period. 2,140 years before the Ubayyad culture in Sumer started to decay. And so, again, my message that we'll get to in a later series is how our current times, as we move into the Age of Aquarius, are looking like we're going to be staring down the barrel of a globalist police state, if you will. So I really appreciate you, taking this part 2 with me, looking at astrology. Hopefully I made it make sense to you as to how history repeating in part 1 fits into what we see with astrology. By the way, this is what Nostradamus was talking about, how he was using history repeating to predict the future. But also, by the way, Nostradamus was talking about the past as well. And all of this, again, coalescing into how God's hands are on the wheel of time and dictating for us what the future will look like. So please tune into part 3 that's coming up. I'm going to talk about Genesis, Exodus, the entire Christian biblical influence in how history is repeating, and really let you know, what was the Garden of Eden? What was Noah's flood? What was Nimrod and Sumer? And how does that tie into history repeating? How does that tie into the astrological ages? Part 3 will be really interesting. So God's blessings to all. Again, I thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.